Hey class, welcome back to our second part of notes, which is the reproductive strategies of animals. So we're not going to get into a lot of the specifics of their systems, but we will talk about our comparing and contrasting kind of a lot of advantages and disadvantages of some different reproductive strategies that animals employ for success in environments. The first thing to remember is why we're learning about this. Characteristic of life, all living things must be able to reproduce and make copies of themselves. It was a key characteristic of what living things were at the beginning of the year. It's also important to understand that we try to put nature and life into boxes to help make sense and categorize the natural world, but sometimes life is strange and doesn't make sense. So here are three examples. While you will not be tested on these specifically, I wanted to show you that these are there's oddball stuff out there. There's things that are sequential hermaphrodites. They will reverse sex during their lifetime. So a wrasse, which is the fish at the top here, can switch to male from female to male. Clownfish have been known to switch from male to female. So by changing, obviously their sex, they change their own role in reproduction. Sexual cannibalism, the idea that sometimes a partner in the mating process will consume and kill the mate before or during or even after this mating process in order for them to be able to actually reproduce. So the black widow spider is an example. So the female is the big one here with the red hourglass, and the male is this tiny one there. And sometimes we see that black widow female kill the male after mating. Parasitic mating, the male anglerfish is actually the small little guy down here attached to the underside, and basically fuses to the female and gets stuck there for life. And his sole purpose is to provide sperm to fertilize her eggs. So this is obviously an ugly deep sea fish, and it's tough finding a mate. And so that's once they find mate, they stay there for life. And the male, really, that's his only role in life is to hang out there, and he actually stays there for all of his lifespan. So just review of sexual reproduction here. What is it? It's taking the DNA from two individuals, combining them into one to form the zygote. So the egg from a female, sperm from the male, they each contain 23 chromosomes. We learned this in meiosis, and they come together to form this zygote, 43 pairs. Now this is in humans. Remember, other animals have different number of chromosomes that develop into the organism. In this case, humans, but obviously we'll be talking about different animals. So gametes are the sperm and egg cells, and they come from two different people or individuals, and they fertilize to form a zygote. So sexual reproduction, what are the advantages and disadvantages? Well, basically in sexual reproduction, the greatest advantage overall is really point one is genetic diversity. Genetic diversity is important for maintaining healthy life in ecosystems and populations in general. They're less susceptible to dying out from the spread of some kind of disease. But the disadvantages really are time, energy, finding mates, competing for mates. Organisms have to wait until they're a certain, age to be sexually mature to produce gametes. And sometimes, fertilization can't take place during pregnancy. So if an organism has a traditional pregnancy where they have this zygote or this embryo held within, they're unable to reproduce more. And remember, the goal of a successful species, survival of the fittest, are ones that can survive and reproduce better than others. So reproducing more is typically seen as better in nature. Another type of sexual reproduction is hermaphrodite. So we talked a little bit about that at the beginning, the idea that individuals can produce both sperm and egg cells. Commonly done in earthworms and sponges. So our example organisms here, we'll kind of use those in class to talk about. But they have both sperm and egg cells. So an individual worm here can produce both sperm and egg cells. An individual sponge here can produce both sperm and egg cells. And that allows for fertilization to take place much more easily because any individual they encounter is a potential mate. So these individuals, they can mate with anyone that they come across. They're not excluded because they're both males or they're both females. They can produce genetically viable offspring with anyone. Disadvantage is that it costs a lot of energy to produce both sperm and egg cells in an individual organism. So it's more energy and time maintaining and producing those structures. So aside from sexual reproduction, we have asexual reproduction. This asexual meaning without sex. This reproduction is going to take place by one organism producing offspring without any fertilization required. They inherit all the DNA from one individual parent, and the offspring are genetically identical. So we're going to talk about a handful of these over on the right-hand side here as we move through the slides. So what are the advantages and disadvantages of the process of asexual reproduction? Well, advantages you can make offspring without a mate, which is a pretty big advantage. You don't have to waste time looking for one. So you don't waste time and energy. But some disadvantages are there isn't going to be a lot of genetic variation or any at all at times. Some dangerous mutations can cause all offspring to have this, which means they're all vulnerable because there's no genetic diversity. And that could be dangerous in terms of the survival of the species. But it's good because we can rapidly produce offspring, and the offspring can be in very large numbers, which is a big advantage for survival as well. So the first type of asexual reproduction we see is binary fission. This is most commonly found in bacteria and protists. But binary fission is essentially splitting into two. DNA is copied and the cells split. It's a pretty simple process we can see outlined here in the video. We start with a rod-shaped bacterial cell, and it takes over our screen. Right? So they start watching an individual, just follow one at a time and watch the split, split, split. That's all binary fission is. The next type of asexual reproduction is referred to as budding. Basically, a new organism just grows off of the body of its parent. The bud is genetically identical to the parent. So we have a Hydra here. Sometimes offspring remain connected to form colonies, and sometimes they split off. So you can see this little individual here growing off the main body of the parent, and eventually it will separate and go fly away and stick somewhere else and grow up to be big and tall and bud off just like other parents do. All right. So Hydra we'll talk about in class as an example. Yeast are another common organism that bud, and some cacti are able to do this process also. The other type of asexual reproduction is referred to as fragmentation, and regeneration comes into play here too. So there's kind of both similar concepts in how they get done, but essentially a piece of the parent will break apart or break off, and that piece will just develop into a whole nother full organism. So in this picture here, you can see like a starfish or sea star. This long arm here was the arm of another larger sea star, and it broke off. And when it breaks off, these all develop into new arms, and eventually they'll grow big and it'll be a full-sized starfish. Planarians do this too. This is another model organism we talk about, where they can be broken and cut right in half and develop into two separate flatworms. Hydra can also do this fragmentation process in addition to budding, which makes them pretty unique organisms. So with all that being said, how are our organisms coming about in terms of fertilization? So we have two types, internal and external. Internal is during the reproductive process. Fertilization occurs inside the organism. Typically, this ensures a good environment for fertilization, which means a higher survival rate of offspring, or a higher number of organisms or eggs that will be fertilized, and doesn't require an aquatic environment, which we'll get into with external. Disadvantages: it requires cooperative behavior. Two organisms have to go through this process together and to get the job done here. We also talk about expending energy, and then fewer fertilized eggs would be a result of internal fertilization. So it's a better environment, but it's going to take more time, longer process, and there's some competition involved, or maybe potentially more competition involved. External fertilization: zygote is formed outside the body. We see that the most common organism, we see that in is fish, where like the female will lay the eggs and then the male follows behind. with the sperm and drops it on top, and then the eggs just kind of hang out, typically, in a specific area that are fertilized in the environment. So they're not in the male or in the female; they're just out into the environment. It's nice because it doesn't require a lot of cooperative behavior. You can get more eggs fertilized this way. You spend less energy. We don't have to take care of the eggs. Some do, but they don't have to take care of them or keep them on them or in them. Less zygotes are going to survive because these eggs are going to be eaten or washed away or harmed by the environment or whatever it may be. And it does require an aquatic environment to do this. Some sponges will do this process also. So you can kind of see the genetic material being released through the top of the sponge. The final piece of information here we'll talk about in reproductive strategy is the amniotic egg. Amniotic eggs are found in reptiles, mammals, and birds. Basically what it means is we have a container. It's not always a shell necessarily, like a hard shell, like a chicken egg, but a chicken egg is a great example. And the organism is contained within this protective layer, and it basically protects from physical damage, limits the evaporation of water, and it's a whole container that allows survival of this embryo as they develop. All of them contain some amount of nutrient in the form of a yolk sac, and so mammals have this, but it's all contained within the female's reproductive system, so they don't need a hard shell. Other organisms like birds obviously have hard shells. Reptiles have more leathery shells, but the reason they have those tougher structures on the outside is because they don't maintain the embryo internally during development like a mammal would.